thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate your time. Just tell me a little bit about yourself and your kind of project.
Yeah, so I think a good place to start, there's really been two major blessings that I've had in life. One is I grew up in a two-parent household that deeply loved the Lord and loved each other and modeled that. And I don't take that for granted. A lot of the personality that I have today, the calmness that I have, it's hard being raised in a one-parent household. So I had the blessing of two. So that's one big check. Then the other, I was exposed to space, my passion, when I was 14 years old. I went to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, and came away from that going as a little pipsqueak, like, I'm going to be in space. Like, I just knew it somehow, some way. Flash forward the next 7, 8, 9 years, whatever, end of middle school, high school, and into college, I kept shifting the aim a little bit with the goal of always being space, but it was, let me grow the food, let me be a doctor, nah, let me do finance. And that really clicked for me. So I graduated with a finance degree, from the University of Georgia in 2020 as the pandemic was lifting off. 1,400 miles away to start a finance job. It was great. It was fine. It wasn't space. And space is just freaking deep within me. And so I went stir crazy rather quickly. And so after building up enough savings, I jumped and I'm doing a master's program slowly out of the Colorado School of Mines. It's a master's in space resource utilization. How do we go to the moon, extract water, iron, really cool stuff. So that's one thing I'm doing. And then the other was in January, February, I realized there's a lot of podcasts. There's a decent amount of space podcasts, as this one, for example. But there aren't any that are long form, hour and a half, 2 hour plus, sit down, let's get deep into who you are as the guest, what you're doing, what are your future outlooks, what are your fears, what are your excitements for the industry, and really build that Joe Rogan styled conversation in the space industry. We don't have that yet. So I started it. And
Yeah.
it's been going great so far, man.
So, were you like a sci-fi nerd when you were a kid? Was it Star Trek, Star Wars, and that sort of thing?
Star Wars was, I would watch it from time to time. Never got into Star Trek until later. But Stargate SG-1 was an incredible show. Watched that as a family. Loved it. Going through wormholes, fighting aliens. It's good stuff.
Yeah, all that sort of stuff. Very interesting. And that's what enticed you and got your appetite going in the first place for kind of space.
As a bedrock, but really the moment was week long at Advanced Space Camp as a 14-year-old. I was a son of the U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel, and it was Air Force U.S. kids versus international students for a week. And we had all these space competitions, blah blah blah. We dove underwater in these big scuba tanks. We flew simulation, like just all things space. And I really got inspired and started imagining and dreaming, saw the possibility of what space can offer, and was like, I have to do this with my life. Just
So, and how many people were at space camp? How many people get to go to space camp?
it's a good question. I think my group or like team was about 30, but we were, let's say 300, something like that. They had different sessions throughout the summer, but yeah.
Are you finding that the vast majority of, apart from the people you mix with because of the master's program and the podcast, but the vast majority of people that you come across really have got no visibility, no understanding, no particular interest in space?
I wouldn't say no interest, but I would say no visibility. If you ask 5 random people on the street of any city, space company, they'll probably say their national program, NASA or ESA, or what's the UK? Do you guys have a separate one?
Yeah, we do have the UK Space Agency.
Okay, that's easy to remember. Um,
Yeah.
right, so they'll probably say that agency, whatever country they're in, probably SpaceX. If they're really in the know, they'll talk about Blue Origin. That's it. And there's over 1,300 space in existence now.
In the UK, I think people would say NASA and SpaceX.
Fair.
Yeah, they wouldn't say the UK Space Agency because although it exists and has quite an extensive program and we're doing a lot, NASA is still the brand of space exploration, and then SpaceX. We might also name Virgin Galactic,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there could be.
possibly because of the Richard Branson connection.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but
It's a thing
that's
that he's doing there.
interesting.
Yeah, it's space tourism. I think it's great. I will say that space in general has a public relations problem. Those masses in the UK or in the US or whatever, not all, but a decent percentage of them will be like, why should I care about billionaires playing with their toys? It's like, okay, surface level, I get the question, I get the concern. At the same time, if you flash all the way back to the first cars that were just invented, not mass produced, but invented, they were in London, they were in England, and like Rolls-Royce came around not too far after that. Those were really nice cars. We couldn't have afforded them. They were for the uber elites. And then airplanes came along. And again, the masses can't afford them. They're for the uber elites. Now you can take a cheap flight on whatever, and we've got Frontier or some of these lower tier airplanes. You can take a flight for $59, and it's pennies in comparison. Space is just a little bit further away on that side. So right now, we see the billionaires playing with their toys. Not only does that enable technology, brand new technology, but even that cost is going to decrease dramatically. So I'm trying to tell that story far and wide as often as possible.
Yeah, I have children who are early 20s, and when I explain to them that, look, they're probably going to live for another 100 years, they'll live to 120.
Probably.
My grandchildren who haven't been born yet might live to 150, 180 years old, that sort of age. So we've actually got 150-year time horizon to think about. That's a long time. Most people's time horizon is 5 years, 10 years, but actually we can think about this in terms of 100 years is the personal time horizon that people can see. Wow, that's a long time. We can do a lot in that period of time.
The aspect of timing, one of the things that I'm really interested in that I don't hear anyone else talking about is as we develop cislunar space, Earth, Moon, rotating around that whole region, cislunar space. As we develop that, let's be generous and then say the next 25 years, and we get thousands of people living and working in space and on the moon, which we could dive into why I think that's a possibility. I think that's an underestimation. To have 10,000 people living in space in 20 years, easy. That develops. A lot of things are going to need to take place. We got to have new legislation that's written that is agreed upon by an international community. That's historically difficult. We got to figure out what resource extraction looks like, what property rights look like. There's a lot of different issues. At some point, maybe it's 25 years, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 150, like you said, for your grandchildren. At some point, there will come a time when the lunar settlement, colony, whatever you want to call it, the lunar people, they're self-sufficient, they're extremely wealthy because of the technology that the moon enables. And they're probably going to look back at their mother nations and be like, why the hell am I giving you all this tax money to pay for failing bridges in the US? Hopefully, if the US is leading this and it's not China that just squashes it with a foot. Hopefully, when that time comes, the US will be understanding and say, hey, we don't want to tax you without representation, all that, blah, 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 jumping back to 1776 time period. And hopefully, it'll be an amicable split like we currently have now with the UK. But I do think that time period will come when the moon is, they have their own weird looking flag. It's an independent nation, whatever you want to call it. And when that time comes, and this is the point I'm getting to, the timing of the political system will be really interesting. China can set timelines of 50 and 100 years in the future, and they don't care if it bothers you because they'll just get rid of your rights. Our democratic systems work a little differently, clearly. And yet in the US, one of the historic problems that space has encountered is we shift our aim almost every 4 years, or every 8 years if we're lucky, and the presidency continues. And that makes it really difficult to build long-term partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. Because space is so vast, because the resources are just freaking infinite, I'm really curious in the 25, 35, whatever amount of years, if we have prime ministers or presidents or whatever title you want to give them, and it's like, now let's do 10-year terms, because space takes time and we need to lengthen our decision-making process. That's just a random thing that I often think about when space comes on up.
Yeah, and it's what becomes enabled as well. And I am probably thinking 50 years to 100-year time frame.
Sure.
So 50 years, 100-year time frame, there's a colony on Mars in that time frame, probably. There's a settlement on the moon, probably. There's some orbiting communes.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Totally.
Probably. Okay. So you got like O'Neill colonies. You're familiar with O'Neill colonies? Okay.
Yeah.
So suddenly you start to go, we don't like this system. Well, on Earthbound, you can't just go away and find new territory because somebody already owns it.
Right.
But in space, you can literally just float off. There are some gravitational effects of different things, but assuming there's propulsion systems that allow you to get into a different orbit somewhere, and just start your own colony with your own laws and your own socio and political value systems. It is possible, and it's just not possible on Earth anymore because we run out of land. There is still plenty of unoccupied land, but there's no unowned sovereign land. Somebody has a sovereign right over it. So I do think it is interesting what will happen socio-politically in space on that sort of time frame, and the paradigm that we have now it is not necessarily relevant to the the paradigm that we'll have in 50 years' time.
Yeah.
It could all have significantly changed. And to your point about political leaders and that, well, who says they're my political leader just because somebody on Earth voted for them? Well, we're floating around in a colony over here. We're completely self-sufficient. We built the bloody thing ourselves, so we're going to do whatever we want, however we want to do it. And who's to stop them? You know, it does become interesting. It becomes very enabling. So do you expect to get into space yourself?
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
I would. So I'm recording this long form podcast right now. I've released 4 episodes. My plan is by episode 500 to be filming that and streaming that on down. So I got a couple strings to pull to make that a reality, but I think
you've got time, as we just said. So let me ask you then. So are you thinking about going for an afternoon trip on above the Kármán line, just bounce up for 11 minutes and come back down again? Are you thinking for a week away on the moon? Or are you thinking Mars, maybe, which is probably a 5-year round trip minimum?
Yeah.
What one of those rings your bell?
At first, I guess it depends on how quickly the prices fall. Because currently, I don't even think Virgin Orbit's, I don't think they got above the Kármán line. So Blue Origin and SpaceX are the only with people that have gotten above the carbon line. Until that price falls dramatically, I think I'll hold on off. What I really want, very first, let me spend a couple of weeks in orbit on one of these new private space stations that are being built and will be in the next 5 to 10 years. Would love to spend some time up there. It costs so much money and effort to get you into orbit. I want to stay for a little while. I joke with some of my friends, like, "Oh, you want to go to space?" I was like my second home to be on the moon, so I got to get to space somehow. Got to get there somehow. So I'd love to, like, you know, get a little moon home, a little tiny setup there on one of the craters, and travel. If I flash forward to like when I'm 45 or so, I'm 25 right now, 45 or 50, something along that. I could easily foresee myself spending at least 3 months out of the year on orbit or on another planetary body. I always want to come back to Earth because it's so beautiful. Mars is just, it's far away. It's red. It's no thanks. Earth and moon and space station, cup of tea.
There are a lot of analogies
Mm-hmm.
and analogs that you can look at. So in the early days, when Columbus went across and found something, he actually thought he was in the Indies at the time, obviously, discovered it was a bit bigger than, somebody discovered it was a bit bigger than that, and all those resources came up. But the trip from Europe to America was a one-way trip most of the time. They weren't coming back.
Yeah.
And then it got a little bit faster. It was on a boat, but so you would go away. You'd probably be expected to be away for 2 years and then come back.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd go away for the season, so it was 6 months. And it's only fairly recently with faster air travel that they go from London to New York in a day and spend a weekend. That's fairly recent. So most of history so far has been your vacation home is you go there for 3 months minimum.
Yeah.
Just because it takes you 3 weeks to get there.
Yeah.
So
I think it'll be the same thing for space. There's a great guy that I talked with who I hosted him on the show. We're going to release that episode soon, from Honeybee Robotics. These guys make drills they've got a drill on Mars currently. We've got a drill on the NASA Viper mission that will go to the moon soon. He talked exactly what you just said and said, look, the settlers of the New World, that was a one-way ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Why would going to Mars be anything different? Mars is really far away, and it would take insane amount of resources to send a SpaceX rocket. Just because you can use the Martian atmosphere to make rocket fuel, it's not going to be efficient. We don't have any infrastructure there. And so it's silly that in any short or even medium term timeline, you'd consider going to Mars and coming back. It's like, nope, you're going to stay there. The moon is a lot closer, physically, communications wise. But interestingly enough, and this blew my mind when I heard it. So in space, physical distance doesn't really matter that much as far as to get, how do I phrase that? Let me take that back. In space, distance only matters when you're dealing with communications. When you're dealing with actual, like, transporting yourself there, like traveling and moving, the most important factor is the gravity that you're coming out of. And so it takes this, if you're in low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station is right now, it takes you more energy units, delta V, takes you more energy units to get from the low Earth orbit to the surface of the moon, not too far away physically. More energy to get from there to the moon than it does to take from low Earth orbit to the moons of Mars. So it's a longer time, but it's far more energy. It's an interesting balancing act if we think of Mars as physically far away and it rotates at this weird oscillation where it takes us a couple years to send stuff, the moon takes more energy to get to it. That may be outweighed just because it's so close and it's always in the same distance. But just something to consider. That blew my mind very recently. I had not heard of that.
So, given your services background, have you looked at, which I think I haven't, but I think it would be an interesting thing to do, and maybe you're just the man to do it, to look at, so how was the early exploration of from Europe towards they sailed west, but they thought they were going east.
Right.
And how was all that funded? Where's the? Because as you pointed out early on, it seems to be the playground of billionaires. But
Sure.
there's a lot of money going into the space industry that isn't coming from billionaires. In fact, billionaires tend to not spend their own money; they tend to organise other people's money. That's why they're billionaires in the first place. But so, what are there any analogies that you've come across, or analogues that you've come across of how funding happened in the early days and what you see now, and mapping those two things together?
It's a great question. Yes. So early explorers, they were funded. Venture capital wasn't really a thing back in 16, 15, 1700. Excuse me. There was small individuals, the dollar values were not there. So if you wanted heavy purse strings, and exploration voyages are always expensive, you had to go to the sovereign nations. You had to go to the kings and the queens of Europe, or the dynasties of Asia. Those guys were the initial funding. The comparison to today is that's your NASA. That's your European Space Agency. That's your UK, your Canadian, your Australian space agencies. Those guys are great because they can set long-term visions and they hold the money gun. And they can shoot the money gun wherever they want. Sometimes they shoot it back at themselves and you have a space launch system that takes 20 years to build. That's an aside. So the kings and queens, I think they really equal the NASAs, the ESAs. But let me add one other point here. The American colonies, they were not sufficient. They were not self-sufficient until they had an exportable commodity. First, we made maps of the land. Check, we've done that on the moon. Then they sent scouting parties. Yep, we've done that on the moon too. Then they made a few permanent settlements. Some of those utterly failed and all their people died, and we just have a few little words to remember them by. But the ones that lived, they didn't become a thriving, birthplace of a city until they said, okay, what can we export for money to the old country? That way we have revenue such and such. And the very first commodity was timber, because UK had used up a lot of their massive timber. They had the largest navy ever, and boats were made of wood. And so in the early days, English inspectors or whatever would come around and they would find the best tree possible and they would mark it. This is Royal British tree property. You'll be hanged or whatever if you cut it down. That's part of their taxes. That's part of the export commodity business. In space, we've been able to export satellite data and images, and that's really helpful, and that helps Earth. But images and data doesn't create an economy. Let me rephrase that. Images and data up there doesn't create a physical ecosystem for people to be, work, live, play, etc. In order to build thriving space stations, in order to have 10,000 people living and working in space and on the moon, you have to have a platform, like a space station. And in order to have a space station that doesn't just get their money from the Queen of England, venture capitalists, they need to have an exportable commodity like timber. So I think at first it'll be, movie production in space, stuff like that. Tom Cruise wants to film a movie in space. Cool, that'll make a ton of money. Awesome. But there will also be things like fiber optic cables that can only be made in space, or special focusing lenses that for laser communications can only be made in space, and they're 100 times more efficient than the ones made on Earth. Your audience can research that. Z-Bland, Redwire Space, they're doing great stuff on that front. So until we have an exportable commodity and a commodities market for that exportable product, space is still going to be reliant on VC money, on begging the kings and the queens to fund their expedition and voyage. Once we get a commodity, then you're in business.
And do you think that's the prize that the privateers currently are focused on, or VC money is focused on, or are we still at the early stage kind of development money, seed capital going in?
I think it depends on what sector within space you look. If you have no knowledge of space, it's all space. But that's like saying the industrial markets of all countries. But that's really vague. What do you mean, industrial resource extraction or manufacturing cars or manufacturing robots? So space has launch, it has satellite production, it has data transmission, it has on orbit, all these different areas. Different subsets of space are at different stages in that development. The rocket launch subset, which is the first one you need, it's really saturated. You shouldn't start a rocket launching company. Just don't do it. You'll lose. And they're already making money. They're exporting a service. We can take your thing into space. So the companies that work, they're closed loop, they're good. They only ask for more money if they really want to expand quickly. But if you go to the other side of the market and you look at, for example, there's a company called Lunar Industries. They've developed a technology, this is episode 1 on my show. They developed a technology to bring in space trash, space debris of metal, melt it on down, and out pops iron and aluminum ingots out the other side in space. There's a lot of companies that have to exist to make that a real market. And if you want more details, listen to the show. But that's an example where they're not yet making any profits, and they won't for some time. So they're very dependent on government money. So it depends on if you look at the beginning or the cutting edge of even the space industry to see if it's kings and queens or if it's privateer exportable commodity.
So what's the big news for you at the moment? What's the thing that's got you the most excited, let's say, that you're looking at, or you can see on the horizon inside the next sort of 3 to 5 years?
Personal or the industry?
Yeah, a bit of both.
Yeah. There's a group out there called Orbit Fab. I should be working with them in the next 2 months or so, probably by the time that this show gets published. What's fascinating to me about them is they've created a gas station in space. And by shipping up a tanker full of hydrogen, full of xenon, full of insert satellite fuel X, fuel Y. By shipping that up there, they can do it really cheaply, just because they can do it cheaply. Once that service comes online, and there are dozens of tankers all around the globe in different orbits, and hundreds of semi-trucks, air quotes, that pick up the fuel from the tanker and then bring it to your satellite and say, oh, you're out of fuel, you're going to crash and burn down in the atmosphere. Why do that? Your electronics are good, your solar panels are good, your attitude, let's just give you more fuel. Boop, boop, boop. 5 more years life expectancy. That's a huge advantage. Or currently, a satellite that is in geostationary orbit, way out there, 50% of its mass, which means about 50% of its launch cost at least, is fuel, because it's so far out there and it has to stay out there for a long time. And so these guys say, no, don't do that. Make a smaller gas tank on your satellite, tiny gas tank, and only fill it up with enough to get you 10 kilometers, 4 miles, whatever, on the road, air quotes. And then it'll be a lot cheaper for you. You can get there faster, and we'll come fill you up, and we'll fill you up every year. That service, that ability, when it's flushed out, it's not just cool for that company. It enables every single other space company to do more of the cool things they're trying to do, because they don't have to worry about fuel. They just call the Uber and it comes and fills them up. I think that's going to be part of the tipping point that really makes space accessible to everybody and their brother.
Vincent, it's been an absolute delight to chat with you. I do hope that we get the opportunity to talk again, maybe at a conference, convention, of which there's plenty kind of around, and then jump on a call. I'd love to keep in contact with you.
Absolutely.